I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I started an eco-conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. So I don't just make pottery, I make resources for other potters wanting to be more eco-friendly in their pottery practice. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's about sharing everything I've learned along my eco-conscious pottery journey with you. And I'm so glad you're here with me. Let's go. Hello and welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about pulling handles. Pulling handles, that's right. So pulling handles for, that would be for, so pulling a handle is basically a way of making a handle in pottery for, say, like things like mugs, for jugs, maybe like, a casserole dish that has a couple of little handles. It could be, say, like, one of those kind of goblet vases with two, Grecian, with like little handles on the side. And pulling a handle is like such a fantastic way of making a handle. It makes a beautifully shaped handle and it's very easy to do. It looks like one of those things that's like super difficult to learn, but it's actually not. It's actually very, very, very easy to do. But I've got 5 really top tips for you, which I've learned through loads of error. Trial and error. Lots of errors basically that has resulted in kind of me now really probably understanding like a really good way of pulling a handle. So I'm really excited to share these with you. These are my 5 top tips for pulling a handle. So in terms of pulling a handle, so first of all, let's just start with like how it's actually done. So basically how you do it is you basically get a roll of clay, and then you've got like a source of water. So you can either use like a bucket of water, a bowl of water, you can do it under a running tap or something. And what you're doing is you're holding your clay with one hand, and then you're repeatedly wetting your hand and smoothing the clay with the other hand. Okay, so you're not really like, pulling is a bit of like a misnomer really, because you're not pulling the handle. You don't want to be like pulling the clay, because you're basically just like going to pull it off. You need to be sort of really gently like smoothing, and you need to make sure that you've got loads of water every time. So it's like dip your hand in water, smooth, dip your hand in water, smooth, dip your hand in water, smooth. You get the picture. And then it basically very gradually, through all that smoothing, it gradually makes the clay longer, thinner. You can start to push in with your thumb if you want like more of a flatter handle. Some people push in with their thumb and then they have like the kind of slight creases down the handle, which looks really pretty. So that's basically how a handle is pulled. And so generally speaking, what happens is the handle is then left to kind of dry, and then it's attached to a pot at a later date. So usually when the handle's like, a bit drier, maybe like, not quite leather hard, maybe ever so slightly less hard than leather hard, because you don't want it to be too hard. But you can't really attach the handle when it's very wet, when you've just made it. So you're making the clay even more wet by, making the handle. So you do need to dry that handle before you can really touch it. Otherwise you're just going to like sort of, mess up the shape of it basically. And so you need it to dry before you attach it to the pot. So another really important thing to say is if you're attaching a handle to a pot, and they're like sort of different levels of dryness, that's when you get problems with them like cracking off. So you can't attach like a really wet handle to a leather hard pot. Well, maybe not, you probably could try and do that, but probably if the pot was like a little bit more dry, that just wouldn't work. It would crack off for sure basically. So you kind of want them to be, even dryness to be attaching, so they don't crack off, and you're attaching it with slip, and scoring and smoothing, and that's how you're attaching your handle. So pulling a handle, you can actually also pull a handle directly on the pot. So potters sometimes get around this whole idea, this whole problem of like having to let the handle dry and spending ages waiting for it to dry, by basically attaching a piece of wet clay to their pot, and then they pull. It's called pulling off the pot. So you're pulling the handle off the pot. You've already attached the clay onto the pot, and you're going to be smoothing the handle down, and then as soon as it's like the desired kind of thickness, then you just attach that handle, the base of it, you pressing the base of it onto the pot, and that like will attach it to the pot, and then you can kind of just like cut off the excess, and that kind of yeah, gets rid of that whole having to let the handle dry and then attaching it to the pot problem. Okay, so that's kind of like a bit of like how handles are actually pulled, and like, you know, brief introduction to like how they're kind of like attached. But in this episode, we're going to be talking about 5 tips for pulling handles, and these are, like I said, all mistakes I've done. And then now I know now that like by not doing these things, you know, by doing them, the 5 tips I'm going to give you, it just works so much better, basically. Okay, so right, my first top tip is that when you're the clay you're going to use to pull your handle, when you get that clay, you want to wedge it, you know, knead it really well, okay? And that's because you just do not want any bits which are hard or soft, you know, in that clay that are not like well mixed in, because when you're pulling the handle, those bits will, they won't pull properly. You'll get kind of lumps in your handle if you've got like a bit which is like a tiny bit drier, or it will cause cracking like later down the line, basically. So wedge your clay really well. I can't stress this enough. This is kind of like my sort of, probably in a way, like the number 1 tip, because you just will not be able to pull a handle if the clay isn't properly wedged. You know, again, you might have an air bubble in there as well. If you don't wedge it properly, you might get an air bubble that might explode your pot, you know. So handles are generally quite, you know, they can be quite thick. So, you know, the chances of it exploding, if it does have an air bubble in, you know, it can be quite high. So yeah, wedge that clay really well. Yeah, so when I say wedge it really well, I mean kind of maybe like 4 or 5 minutes of wedging. You know, just to kind of, you know, if you were like wedging, yeah, 4 or 5 minutes would be really well wedged clay, or kneaded, however you call it. So, okay, so that's the tip number 1, wedge your clay really well. Okay, here's my second tip. My second tip is to use clay that is kind of erring on the drier side than on the wetter side. So I have tried to pull a handle with like wet, you know, really wet clay, like very soft clay. And let me tell you, it's pretty much like impossible to do it. So you need clay which is, you know, has more strength to it. So you need clay which is drier, because you're adding moisture as well. When you're smoothing that clay with the water, smooth with the water, you are adding more moisture. And, you know, so if it started off pretty dry, it's going to be, you're going to have very wet clay by the end. So you don't want very wet clay to begin with. You want it to keep its structure, you know, you want it to be able to withhold lots of smoothing and water, basically. So err on the side of having more dry clay than wetter clay. So perhaps even drier clay than you would even have to kind of throw a pot, you know. You kind of want it to be erring. You don't want leather hard clay, that's too dry, but like, you know, erring on the drier side of, you know, wet usable clay, basically. Okay, so that's tip number 2. And then tip number 3, which is something that like suddenly dawned on me after I was making these, you know, after I was making handles for years and years. So basically, right, I used to start off with like a huge roll of clay, and I would spend ages smoothing it down to like the handle kind of thickness I wanted it to be. And then one day it suddenly dawned on me, why don't I just make the rolls of clay thinner? And then I just smooth it for a little bit, you know, and then that's my handle pulled. So I used to think by pulling a handle, it was like a really long process. And now I realise that you can actually have a roll which is almost the same thickness as the handle you want, and you're just smoothing it for a little bit, and that's kind of essentially pulling the handle, because it still looks the same, you know, it looks really beautiful. You've got that same like beautiful shape that you've made with half the time, half the effort. The clay stays drier, which is a good thing. You don't end up with this like massively long handle that you have to then chop up, you know. So it's much better just to start off with quite a thin roll of clay, you know, to start with. You don't, just gives yourself so much less work to be having to smooth that handle down. Okay, so that's my third top tip. Thinner rolls, a thinner roll of clay than thicker is fantastic. Less work. Okay, so here is my fourth top tip. Okay, so when I first started pulling handles, I would see other potters, and I'd seen on telly, I think, somewhere, potters who had made the handle were then hanging them on the side of the table. And this was like a really good way of sort of making sure that nothing touched the handle. So, like, literally, like, they would take the hand that they were used to hold the clay, and they would then just squash the clay on the side of the table, and then the handle would just hang down off the table, just drying basically. And it was a really good way of drying the clay, making it drier, not letting anything touch it to kind of mess up the look of it or anything like that. But when I actually came to attach my handles, what I found was, especially ones that I'd let dry for quite a while on the table, just hanging off the side, dead straight. What would happen is when I came to curve them in the position where I wanted, like the curved handle, that, like, say, like a curved mug handle, what would happen is they would crack. They would particularly crack at this kind of real kind of pinch point at the very when it's the most curvy, sort of like at the very top. If you think about a handle being attached to a cup, the bit where it's really curving out, they would quite often crack, and that's because they were kind of the clay was very straight, it was drying in a straight position, and then suddenly I was kind of moving it into this kind of curved shape, and it was like, help, I don't like it, and it would crack, and it was very frustrating because you'd made a handle, you'd spend ages letting it dry, and then it would break, and then you couldn't use it. So it was really, really frustrating. So what I started doing then was I started actually drying them in the position that I wanted the handle to be in. So what I did was I'd take the hand that I had, that I was holding the handle in, and then I would take my other hand, I would just curve the handle, and I would stick it to the table in a curved position. So I would stick the hand that was like holding the handle, I would stick that clay to the table, and then I would curve the handle round, and then I would stick the other end, a bit longer. I don't want to make any marks on the actual kind of handle that I will use. So a bit further down, I would then stick that bit to the table. So you're basically drying it in this curved position. So if that makes sense, you're kind of, in a way, you're using the table like you would the side of a pot. You're basically sticking the handle onto the table like you would on the side of a pot. But because you're kind of leaving a bigger loop than you would if you were sticking it on your mug or jug, then you're going to be cutting that handle down, so you're not going to be using those ends which are like stuck to the table. So then what I would do is I would sort of like leave it to dry, or I would use a desk fan just to kind of blow air over it, and that would be a really good way of drying a handle really quickly without using too much energy. I've spoken about this actually in another episode, where a desk fan uses 1/90th of the energy of a hot air gun, one of those heat guns that you use for like stripping paint. We used to have one actually in the pottery studio I learned pottery in. And yeah, so they use so much energy, whereas a desk fan just kind of blows air, over the handle, dries it like a little bit more slowly, but still does a really good job of drying the handle. So yeah, that's my top tip if you want to dry a handle, a bit quicker. Actually, that's a bonus tip because that's not part of the 5 tips. But if you want to dry a handle a bit thicker, just use a desk fan. Set up a desk fan, just blow air over it, and it will dry, really quickly. Okay, so tip number 5 is that when your handle is dry enough to attach the pot, so we're not looking for leather hard, we're looking for like a little bit less hard than leather hard, because leather hard is too hard really to attach to the like a mug or something. So we want a handle which is like a little bit less hard than leather hard. A really good top tip for getting the right angle when you're cutting the handle is that you could use a very long blade. So for example, I actually use a decorating tool, a scraper. So like say decorators, they use like a scraping tool to kind of like fill like holes in the wall basically, and it's like a kind of metal blade they use to kind of scrape filler into the it's not a sharp blade, it's just like a piece of metal basically. And so you could use a ruler, you know, if you had a metal ruler. You could use a knife if you have a kind of longer knife. You could use one of those pastry cutters, you know, those dough dividers, which are kind of, they have like a long kind of like a blunt metal kind of blade. It's not blade really, it's like a kind of just like a block of metal, thin block of metal that then you can use to cut dough. So yeah, using a long blade is fantastic, because if you're cutting across one end of the handle and the other end of the handle, you know that you've got the right angle, if that makes sense. So you're going to be cutting the top and the bottom of the handle at the same time, and then you know it's the correct, exactly the correct angle to be attaching to the pot. So that's my other top tip: cut both the top and the bottom of the handle when you're going to be putting it on the pot. So you need to cut that bit off, you know, the squidgy bit that you squidge on the table. You need to be cutting that off to make a really, you know, sharp edge, fine, like lovely handle. So to use a long blade, because then you're cutting both the top and the bottom at the same time, and then you know that the angle is absolutely perfect. You're using that straight tool to do it. So and then you're going to be attaching it onto your mug, like, or jug. So you know that's straight, like if you're chopping it straight, you know that straight part will then attach straight onto your mug or jug. And then what you can do is, this is another bonus tip, once you've actually cut your handle, you can hold it up against your pot just to check it's the right kind of scale for the pot. So quite often I've made a handle and then I've kind of held it up against I've cut it, held it up against the mug, and I thought, no, it's actually too big. It looks really big against this mug. So then I've kind of got the blade again, and I've again chopped a little bit off the top and bottom at the same time, and then I've held it up again against the mug, and then you can just see, you know, aesthetically, like, how does it look? Does it look even? Does it look right against the, you know, the size of the mug basically? So that's a really good thing to do. So err on the side of making a bigger handle, and then you can always chop bits off. There's been times when I've made a handle too small, I've chopped too much off, and then then you're just basically like, great, I just have to make a new handle now because it doesn't look right, you know. And you can't have a really tiny handle that people can't really use, you know. So okay, so those are my top tips with 2 bonus tips in there. So let's run through the tips again. The first one is you'll knead your clay really well, and then it'll be much easier for you to make, you know, a very smooth, perfect handle with no cracks, with no bumps in it. It will allow you to really smooth that handle really, really well. The next thing is to use dryish clay, because you're adding water. You don't want the clay to be too wet, you know, to start with. So use dryish clay to start with. Use thinner rolls rather than thicker rolls to start with, because why make things difficult for yourself for having these really thick rolls that you're having to smooth down lows? Just start with a handle that's nearly the same size, you know, and just pull it, you know, smooth it, pull it a little bit, and then you'll have like a beautiful handle, and the clay will stay quite dry as well, which is great. The third top tip is dry it in the position of the exact position that you need it to be on the pot. And that will stop the clay from getting stressed when you come to try and stick it onto the pot. You're not having to try and get like dry clay to, you know, bend it into position, because clay, you know, won't like it and it might start cracking, probably will start cracking. So it's a great idea to dry it in position, you know, stick it to a table, pretend your table is the side of your mug, and then that'll be amazing, like dry it like that. Bonus tip, use a desk fan to dry it if you're in a rush. That's great. And then cut the handle when you come to use it. Cut the handle straight across top and bottom at the same time, and that will give you the right angle for sticking it on your pot. Bonus tip. I've sort of lost track of how many we're on, maybe like 7 or something. This is tip number 7. Hold the handle up against your pot. And that will you'll know then if it's the right scale basically. You don't want a really small handle or a really big handle, and that will just really allow you to kind of see the perfect size handle basically. You can always chop bits off again. So yeah. well, okay, that's all the tips for, pulling a handle. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I've had loads of fun, like talking to you about handles. Like I said, I've made all these mistakes. I've cracked so many handles and cut them too small, and dropped them in the sink, and pulled too hard and pulled the end off. And it's just, this is what happens when you're trying to learn how to pull a handle, but hopefully these top tips, these 5, 7, whatever tips will have helped you, when you're maybe pulling your own handles and trying pulling handles. It looks difficult, but it's not. And I would really urge you to try it, because it just makes such a beautiful handle. Honestly, they just look so good. Okay, so I'll see you on the next episode. Until then, happy potting, and I'll see you then. Bye. So if you enjoyed that and you're interested to learn more about eco-conscious pottery, head over to the Oxford Clay website, which is www.oxfordclay.co.uk. I can't wait to see you there.